Should you prune your tomato plants, and what is the benefit of it? It seems like every gardener out there has their own method of pruning tomatoes, and indeed there are just so many different ways that you can do it. So the goal of this video is to give you the tools and understanding that you'll need to make the decision for yourself. So why prune at all? There are really two main reasons that we prune our tomato plants. The first is to keep the plants healthy. Tomatoes, as you probably know, are very susceptible to diseases, but by pruning, we can decrease the chances that the plants will get diseased in the first place or push it off further in the season, ultimately leading to bigger yields. And the second reason we prune is to increase overall yield for certain varieties. Now, there are different pruning techniques based on the type of tomato plant that you're growing, and I will get to that later in the video, but I want to start with 3 ways that I recommend you prune regardless of the type of tomato. But first, just a bit of tomato anatomy. There are 3 main parts of your tomato plants. First are the leaves. They look like this. They can range in size, but usually they're pretty long. They come off of main stems at a near 90-degree angle, and these are what produce the energy for your plants to do everything that they do. Second are the flower trusses, which look like this, and they're very important because they will produce yellow flowers, which will eventually become your tomatoes or your fruits. And third are sucker shoots, and we're going to talk a lot about sucker shoots later on, but these are essentially entire tomato plants coming off of your tomato plants. So there are cases where you want to leave those on and other cases where you'll want to prune them off. Now, before you do any pruning, you definitely want to have a sharp pair of pruning shears that has recently been cleaned. I like to use isopropyl alcohol and just wipe down the shears and the handles right before pruning or between prunings of different plants. Okay, so let's start with 3 types of pruning that you should do regardless of the type of tomato that you're growing. First is bottom pruning. So you'll want to start near the bottom of the plant and look for leaves that are near the soil line. It's good to keep your leaves off of the soil to prevent disease from entering the plant from any soil-borne pathogens, and this also improves aeration around the base of your plants. I usually go for the first 6 or 12 inches depending on the size of the plant overall, and I'm mainly focused on removing the leaves from this portion of the plant. You may want to remove some flowers if it looks like the resulting fruits will touch down into the soil, because those fruits are pretty likely to get rotted. The second pruning technique we do on all of our tomato plants is thinning out the overall plant. So removing any dense foliage that is mainly inside of the plant or overlapping with other foliage. And the goal here is to just improve aeration throughout the plant. You should sort of be able to see through your plant from all angles. So just pick and choose a few leaves every week or so. And your goal should be to keep the outer foliage intact and remove any leaves that are pointing inwards or are otherwise shaded by the plant itself. These leaves aren't really doing much to begin with because they're either shaded or they're lower down on the plant where they're not getting the sun that they need to produce energy. And after all, that's the entire job of your tomato leaves. And the third pruning technique that we use on all of our tomato plants is removing dying, dead, or diseased foliage. This is a great example here. I would have pruned this off earlier, but I wanted to leave it for this video. You can see this leaf is sort of turning yellow, and I'm not sure whether or not this is disease at this point, but regardless, the foliage is unhealthy, it's dying back, and it's no longer providing benefit to the plant. So with those basic pruning techniques, you're really in a good spot. You're definitely going to have healthier plants overall, and it will help stave off disease later on in the season. But what do we do for specific tomato varieties? I'm going to break this down into 3 main categories: determinate plants, indeterminate plants, and small tomato varieties like cherry and grape varieties. So first of all, if you don't know the difference between determinate and indeterminate tomatoes, they're basically the 2 main groups of tomatoes. So you'll see this on your plant tag or your seed packet. And basically your determinate tomatoes will grow to a certain size, stop growing at that point, and produce all of their fruits at once. So you end up with a very large harvest all at the same time. Indeterminate tomatoes, like this one here, will grow continuously and give you regular harvests throughout the season. There's really no end to their growth. The tip of the plant will just keep growing and growing until it's killed by frost later in the year, and you get smaller harvests more regularly throughout the year. So I'll start with the easy one, which is determinates. If you're growing determinate tomatoes, you're just going to use the pruning techniques that I talked about earlier in the video: bottom pruning, pruning away dead, dying, or diseased foliage, and thinning out overly dense leaves. If you're growing indeterminates that are larger tomato varieties, so anything besides cherry and grape varieties, so your slicers or your beefsteak tomatoes, then there's some pretty involved pruning work that's recommended. Starting from an early stage, you'll want to remove suckers from your plant, leaving 1 or 2 main stems or leaders on your tomato plant. From there, you can trellis the plants upwards and tie them to string because they tend to grow very tall when you use this pruning technique, but it will make it possible to plant your tomatoes closer to one another. You'll make use of a lot more of your vertical space, and you'll get bigger, better tomatoes as well. So let's talk about those suckers. I have one here, and like I said, it's basically an entire tomato plant growing off of your tomato plant. They form between the main stem and a leaf node, so right between there, that's where you're gonna find your suckers coming out, and you wanna prune these off as soon as you see them coming in. If you don't prune them, they will develop basically another main stem alongside your actual main stem that is planted into the ground, and that steals energy away from that original main stem. So if you don't prune these off, you'll end up with dozens of suckers on your plant, and you just won't have very large fruits on those offshoots of the main stem. So you really have to keep on top of this, especially early on in the season. The plant really wants to put those suckers out because tomato plants are sort of opportunists. They're gonna put out growth wherever they can, wherever there's light, and they'll end up very sprawling. They'll get overly dense and your fruits will be smaller. So in addition to the techniques that I mentioned earlier, you're gonna wanna remove almost all of the suckers from your plants. And again, it's important that you're only doing this for larger tomato varieties. So basically anything larger than a large cherry type tomato, you'll probably wanna use this technique. This here is our Better Boy tomato, and it's a classic tomato shape, much larger than a cherry tomato, and it's also indeterminate. So I'm gonna be pruning away sucker shoots, and I have some pretty large ones here to remove. And I've been doing this basically from day one. Like I said, the plant will produce lots of suckers, and you wanna prune it back to 1 or 2 main stems. But I'll show you what a small sucker looks like, and I'll show you what a larger sucker looks like. I have a pretty large one here that I can remove. Now, like I said, this is basically another tomato plant growing off of your main tomato plant. It'll produce leaves like you see here. It will produce flowers and tomatoes, and it will even produce more suckers. But like I said, in the case of larger indeterminates, you do want to remove most of these so that they don't steal the energy away from your main stem. But you can use this to grow another tomato plant. Basically, you want to stick this down into a few inches of water and leave it in a shady spot outdoors for about a week or 2 until it starts forming roots. Transplant it into the garden, and you've got yourself another tomato plant. If you want to learn more about cloning tomatoes, we have a video on our channel, which I'll link to in the description below. It's not ideal to wait to this point to prune your suckers because they've already started to take away some energy. Most of the suckers I'll remove at this stage here when they're about 1 inch or 2 long before they take much energy away from the plant. That way the plant can immediately focus its energy back on the main stem where you want it to. We've also bottom pruned this plant, and I will be thinning it out if I see excess foliage. The leaves on this plant are huge, so we want to make sure again that the airflow throughout the plant is adequate. Now finally, the last category is small tomato varieties, so cherries and grape varieties like this one here. This is a Sun Gold cherry tomato. And thankfully, things are simplified once again if you're growing cherry tomatoes, because we don't recommend pruning most of your suckers unless they're creating overly dense foliage like we talked about before. You can prune them out if you need to, just to open up and aerate the plant, but leaving the suckers on for cherry and grape varieties will increase your overall yield, and you'll still get good size, full size tomatoes off of the suckers. People often think cherry tomatoes will end up being smaller plants, but that's definitely not true. It's only early summer and this plant is already 3 feet tall and beginning to really bush out. It's gonna be huge by the end of the season, but it will also be covered in cherry tomatoes. So I'll do a before and after on this one. So before and after. As you can see, I removed quite a bit of foliage from this plant with a primary focus on bottom pruning because this is a cherry tomato. There's really not too much pruning to do other than clearing up excess foliage and removing bottom leaves. So now you can see air is just gonna flow right through this plant, keeping excess humidity away from this plant and decreasing disease. And now, since some of these leaves look like they might have had some disease to them, I'm gonna wash my hands and clean up my pruners before I move on. So should you prune your tomatoes? Yes, I think you should in most cases. At least do the bare minimum and clean up lower foliage and excessively dense foliage just to improve that aeration and decrease your chances of disease. But let us know the type of pruning that you do. We love to learn new techniques and try new things in our garden. And thanks for watching Geeky Greenhouse.